In this video, I'll show you how I started with this straight piece of solid cherry and created this circular arc curved piece. These will be the front facer boards of a curved front display case that I'm working on. And there's a separate video for the full build of that project, but here's a quick look ahead view of that display case with these bent laminations. The process to create these curved pieces involves resawing a piece of wood into thin strips on the bandsaw, and then I'll surface the thin strips of wood using a sled on my thickness planer since I don't have a drum sander. Then I'll glue it back together in a circular arc using a form. So let's get started. The first step is to make a form, or essentially a clamp in the shape that I want the bent lamination to be. I'm making the form from a couple of pieces of plywood that I glue together in order to get the thickness that I want for the final width of the bent lamination, which is 1 1/4 inches thick. So kind of a kludge, but I built some temporary structure onto the form to attach the pivot point for the circle cutting jig. I'm going to cut these pieces off later. To cut the curve shape in the form, I'm going to use a circle cutting jig. It requires a pivot around a center point at a radius of a curve which is 11 inches inside diameter and 11.5 inches outside diameter. So this makes for the 1/2 inch final thickness that I want my bent lamination workpiece to be. And so I just stick on the pivot cookie for the circle jig using double-sided tape. And I'm using the circle jig on the router table with the 1/2 inch bit. The 1/2 inch bit gives me the difference between the inside diameter and the outer diameter that I want. And I make just several shallow passes until the last pass finally cuts all the way through. And now just to cut off the temporary structure that was needed just for the circle cutting jig, and what I'm left with is the form that'll be used to glue up the bent lamination. Before starting the resaw, I'm just going to double check that the fence angle is set to the drift angle of the blade. To get that angle, I mark a line parallel to one edge on a scrap piece of wood, and then just freehand cut down that line on the bandsaw. When I feel like I have a nice straight cut going, then I turn off the bandsaw and mark a line on the table. And now I can just adjust my fence to match this pencil mark line on the table. The final thickness of each strip I want is about 1/10 of an inch, so to give myself a little bit of room to plane off the rough edge, I'm going to set the bandsaw at about 1/8 of an inch. To set my fence, I use an 1/8 inch drill bit so that it just barely touches the teeth of the blade. I make the resaw cut with the help of a feather board just to hold the workpiece up against the fence. And I'm using a 1/2 inch blade with 4 teeth per inch, and it's cutting through this piece of cherry like butter. Before making the next resaw cut on the same piece of wood, I clean up the just cut surface on the joiner so that each piece has at least one plain flat side after a cut. And then I just make the next cut on the bandsaw and repeat until all of the slices are cut. So now I have this pile of strips. Each one's pretty cleanly planed on one side, but rough cut from the bandsaw on the other side, which I'll need to clean up using a sled on my planer. Unfortunately, I don't have a drum sander, otherwise that would be a much better choice. I'm debating if I need to stick down the leading edge with some double-sided tape. If the pieces are really thin, then that would be needed, but it seems like these are stiff enough to not get sucked up and shredded in the planer. I made this sled by gluing some pieces of solid wood onto a piece of plywood and keeping the grain oriented so it runs parallel to the sled direction. Applying some paste wax to the bottom of the sled will help it glide smoothly through the planer. These end blocks will probably help reduce slipping of the workpiece, but the real benefit of both the end blocks and the shepherd pieces along the sides is to eliminate planer snipe. So same as any time I use a planer, just making multiple shallow passes until all the bandsaw marks are gone and the final thickness of all the pieces is about 1/10 of an inch. Before I slice the pieces on the bandsaw, I marked a V on the edge so that now I can match up the pieces and as best as possible match the edge grain on the final curved workpiece. I was able to get 4 pieces from each slice and at 1/10 of an inch each, then I just add one from an adjacent board and it gives me the 1/2 inch thickness that I'm looking for. And after putting some painter's tape on the form, this puppy is ready to glue up. With an even coat of glue across all the pieces, then I sandwich them all in the form and pull it together with clamps. This form is a little awkward. Perhaps I could have come up with a better design, easier to clamp, but I finally figure it out and get it done. So a little bit of a learning here for me is I didn't expect this much of a spring back after removing it from the form. The final piece came out about 1/4 of an inch wider than the form. Probably if I'd used thinner pieces, this would have been a lot less of a discrepancy. A second learning for me is that I rough cut the pieces too wide. I cut them a full 1/4 inch wider than I wanted the final width to be, and now I need to plane down to get to the width I want. I probably would have been better off going with a rough cut of only about 1/16 of an inch wider and then just used a sander to clean up the edges after the glue up. But all in all, I'm pretty happy with the result and ready to move on to building the curved front display case. Thank you so much for watching, and if you think I've earned it, it'd be great if you hit that thumbs up like button and consider subscribing.